about a year ago, saw a letter to the editor in a very small town not far from here, written by an LGBT activist, where his letter was stating the fact that because LGBT issues were so important that he no longer needed to be civil. And he wrote that in a letter to the editor. And I was quite floored by that, and panelists, I offer that challenge to you. You have written a rebuttal to this gentleman. It was basically, gay men are dying because they are committing suicide because they feel stigmatized and shamed. Thus, I have no more reason or ethical reasons to be civil anymore. So I'll turn that question to you as you give your remarks. Our three presenters will take 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we'll open up for a Q&A at the end. So if you want to just pose your questions, we'll take those as we go along. Our first presenter is Michael Erickson, who is an attorney and a columnist for Deseret News and has written some wonderful articles. Some of you that are local probably have seen those articles. Michael, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to a minute to tell us some of your background, how it relates to this topic. Give us some context.
Thank you, Marcia. When Marcia asked me that question, I had an experience that came to mind a couple of years ago after I wrote the first column that was published in Deseret News. Ron Arquette invited me to be on his program briefly. He had a few questions about the subject matter. I addressed the issue of civil rights and the comparison that civil rights is made to same-sex marriage and other LGBT issues. Rod asked me at the end of that program, he said, Michael, what do we do when we're having a conversation with someone and they say to us, well, that's just a bigoted response. You're a bigot. How do we respond to that? What do we say to them? And I paused for a moment and Rod asked me that question. Had a few responses that flashed through my mind, things that you might say. I think Rod maybe was looking for a witty response, something that could be said definitively to put the discussion to the end. But I thought to myself when he asked that, and I felt something, and I responded and I said, Rod, I don't think it matters so much what we say as it matters how we say it. And if we respond with firmness but with love, then people will know that we're not bigoted. You know one when you see one, and you can feel it in the way in which someone responds. And I suppose that's a bit of how.
And you're an attorney, so we're going to let's introduce all three of them, and then I'll turn it over to you. So you want to tell us what kind of law and all that good stuff?
I practice commercial litigation, and my community service involved in pro-family policy.
Okay, great. And Alison Marsh is the co-founder of Fatherhood Foundation, and she's come to us all the way from Australia, and we're grateful she has done that. Give you a minute or so. Give us some of your background.
As a co-founder of the Dads for Kids Fatherhood Foundation, my husband and I interact with dads all across Australia. And you spoke about the middle people shrinking, but I think the middle people have got to find their voice too. So we outreach to any dads all over the nation.
Thank you. Lastly, we have Jeanneane Dixon Maxon. Did I say that right? Mm-hmm. And she is the Vice President of the External Affairs and Corporate Counsel for Americans United for Life, and her colleague Jeanneane Yost, you heard her earlier today.
And I'm not as wonderful as Jeanneane is, but she is my boss, so you can probably say that I said that. So my history is I actually grew up in the pro-life movement. How many of you are, excuse me, and I didn't know how to turn off my phone, good reminder for everyone else. If you're familiar with pro-life pregnancy centers, the pro-life pregnancy centers that are kind of dotting up all across the country, they now outnumber abortion clinics 5 to 1 in the United States, and there's a number of them overseas as well. I grew up as a daughter of a pregnancy center director when I was 7, but my parents were pro-life activists since I was in utero. So I have really been able to see from a very young age the progression of the movement. And it's interesting to hear the terms bigots and haters, because I think I'm kind of on the easy side now, because the great news about the pro-life movement is science and technology has caught up with the truth, right? But we've been saying it for years in different ways and mechanisms, and we've tested out different messages, but science and technology is finally catching up to the truth, and you'll hear more in my presentation today, but the pro-life movement really is winning. And I don't think anyone, at least in the United States, looks at your average pro-lifer anymore and says, you're off the front, the bigot, the hater. Because 47% of Americans now self-identify as pro-life in the latest Gallup polls. So it's a pretty even split in our country now, which is really great news, and I think that there's a lot of victories that we're seeing, which I'm looking forward to sharing with you. But a bit more about my background. So after spending my life in the pro-life movement as an child and adolescent, I went to law school. I did do commercial litigation for a few years, and that's all I could take. I left as soon as I could. And I got my first job in the nonprofit world 10 years ago for a national organization called CareNet that oversees affiliates for their affiliation standards for pregnancy resource centers, and worked for them for 5 years, served on the board of Americans United for Life for a time, and then made the decision to come on full-time on staff with Americans United for Life 4 years ago, and that's where I'm at.
Thank you, Jeanneane. Thank you. Panel, we'll turn it over to you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cultural issues at their heart are moral issues, and that explains why they are so difficult to talk about. While policy disagreements can tolerate reasonable differences in opinion, cultural issues are matters of right versus wrong. The most fiercely contested culture war in the United States was the terrible Civil War over states' rights to enforce human slavery. During the secession crisis, Abraham Lincoln wrote then-friend Alexander Stephens, soon to be Vice President of the Confederacy, "You think slavery is right and ought to be extended, while we think it is wrong and ought to be restricted. That, I suppose, is the rub." Writing a century later, historian Bruce Catton surmised Southerners liked being called sinners no better than anyone else. And that is a concise explanation for why cultural issues inflame passions. In our pluralistic societies, civility is a necessary etiquette for expressing disagreement over contested moral norms. Long before anyone listens to what we have to say about moral issues, judgments will have already been made about how we have said it. But while civility is necessary for discussing cultural issues, it is insufficient for affecting social change. Moral change in society always requires a change of heart in individuals. Moral majorities are marshaled by the force of moral advocacy, and moral advocacy requires more than civility. Said the Christian apostle Paul, "Though I speak with the tongue of angels, of men and angels, and have not charity, I have become the sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal." Civility opens doors. Charity changes hearts. With that in mind, here are 4 principles for changing hearts while engaging on cultural issues. First, show a better way. Build a better house. Many wrongs persist, not because society does not recognize them as such, but because many doubt that there is any other way. Indifferent voices insist that society must tolerate necessary evils, because this is, after all, not a perfect world. But imperfect as it is, moral advocates can give hope for a better world by showing loving alternatives. Raised in a strongly pro-choice environment, I recall vividly a presentation in my early 20s about the hopeful alternative of adoption for crisis pregnancies. I had never before heard someone lovingly explain how expecting parents might humbly recognize their inability to provide all that a child deserves including a married mother and father, and then courageously give their child that blessing through adoption. My heart changed that day. Joseph F. Smith was the 6th president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormon Church. To one of his missionary sons, he wrote this fatherly counsel: "No friendship was ever gained by an attack upon principle or upon man, but by a calm reason and the lowly spirit of truth. If you have built for a man a better house than his own, and he is willing to accept yours and forsake his, then, and not till then, should you proceed to tear down the old structure. Rotten though it may be, it will require some time for it to lose all its charms and fond memories of its former occupant. Therefore, let him, not you, proceed to tear it away." Moral advocates change hearts by showing alternatives to cultural wrongs. Second, dare to shine a light. Societal wrongs cannot withstand the light of moral scrutiny. To avoid exposure, moral wrongs mask themselves as societal rights. Pro-slavery advocates, for example, deflected moral objections by trumpeting slavery as a constitutional right. When moral wrongs are said to be civil rights, moral advocates are caught between a rock and a hard place because the topic suddenly becomes off limits. As Abraham Lincoln Riley observed, "We must not call it wrong in politics because that is bringing morality into politics. We must not call it wrong in the pulpit because that is bringing politics into religion." The incomparable Abraham Lincoln. And the stigma persists in private conversations as well, for as we all know, etiquette instructs that in polite company one must neither talk about either religion or politics. But on cultural issues, we must talk about both. Moral advocates are always made to feel like social bores. And even worse, once a wrong is exposed, its advocates immediately divert attention by accusing others of wrongdoing, especially those who have exposed the wrong. Lincoln described this as reversing the divine rule and calling not the sinners, but the righteous to repentance. Speaking up on cultural issues will always feel lonely. And standing alone requires courage. I ask myself, what does this principle have to do with charity? The answer came: perfect love casteth out fear. Courage to do right springs from love for God and for God's children. Moral advocates change hearts by daring to shine a light on cultural wrongs. Third, be for truth, not against anyone. Cultural wrongs often take hostages, using vulnerable persons as human shields. Taking aim at the moral wrong risks injuring those caught in the crosshairs. Lincoln often compared the circumstances of American slavery to finding a snake in a bed full of children. Striking too carelessly to destroy the snake, he would warn, risks injuring the children. Lincoln was unsparing in his criticism of the institution of slavery, but he was magnanimous in his judgment of the people of the South. I have no prejudice against the Southern people. They are just what we would be in their situation. If slavery did not now exist amongst them, they would not introduce it. If it did now exist amongst us, we should not instantly give it up. This I believe of the masses north and south. With the moral issues of our day, we might ask ourselves, what would our opponents believe if they had our experiences? What would we believe if we had their experiences? Moral advocates wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against the powers of darkness of this world. Moral advocates change hearts by being for truth without being against anyone. Fourth, elevate humanity. Cultural wrongs depend on false ideas about human worth. If one race is inferior to another, there is no reason to treat them equally. If life is not as valuable at its beginning or its end, there is no need to defend it at all times. If desires cannot be channeled, there is no need to restrain them. Societal ills fester in the denigration of human worth, value, and potential. The antidote to such ills, therefore, is to elevate humanity. British abolitionists published the image of a prayerful slave pleading, "Am I not a man and a brother?" In our era, penetrating images of the unborn can stir our hearts with the pleading, "Am I not a life and a child?" When moral advocates focus inordinately on societal sins, they risk falling prey to the dim view of humanity upon which all cultural wrongs thrive. Charity rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth. Next to the Bible, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe was the best-selling book in the 19th century. It spread anti-slavery sentiment in the North perhaps more than any other abolitionist publication. But rather than dwell on the evils of slaveholders, the central message of Uncle Tom's Cabin is the divine potential of the slave. Moral advocates change hearts by elevating humanity. In summary, civility is not enough. Civility opens doors, but charity changes hearts. 4 principles can help moral advocates engage on cultural issues. First, show a better way. Build a better house. Second, dare to shine a light. Third, be for truth, not against anyone. And fourth, elevate humanity. These principles focus less on what we should say and more on who we should become when we advocate for morality in the public square. Abraham Lincoln said it succinctly 150 years ago: with malice towards none, with charity for all.
Alison, set up here.
I'll come up and see.
Hi. Is it lumpy, wiggly? My name is Alison Marsh. I'm from Australia, so I hope you can understand me. Just tell me if I speak too quickly. On Tuesday, the 11th of August, 2015, that's this year. Is that distracting you? No. Turn it off. You found your on-off switch, didn't you?
Just pull that down.
It's right below your arm, Mike.
Right below mine.
Yeah.
I see.
There you go.
Does that take turn?
Is it still on?
At least it's not moving.
Just pull your cord out. and it'll
Oh,
stop.
right. This will do it.
That did it.
Okay. On Tuesday, the 11th of August, 2015. You've got to plug a lot of things back in again to get that picture up. My husband and I took 2 women into our federal parliament house. We had a meeting first off with a member of the Nationals. I hope this isn't too confusing, our political system. This gentleman was a member of our Conservative Country Party. The first woman was Katie Faust from Seattle, USA. The second was Millie Fontana from Melbourne, Australia. Although they were from different countries, both had a common bond. They were both raised by lesbians. After initial introductions, Millie spoke to our parliamentarian first. As a donor-conceived child of lesbians, she felt that she had grown up with a terrible father hunger in her life. She acted out a lot. She loved to hang out with her friends who had fathers in their home. She was always over at their places, starving for some father time. From the time that Millie became aware of her lack, she began to ask her mothers who her father was. They wouldn't tell her, instead saying that it wasn't necessary or it wasn't important. All their family needed was love. Millie continued with her demands, determined to know her dad. Randomly, when she was around 11 years old, her birth mother one day picked up the phone and called the man who was her birth father. Millie was astonished that it only took a simple phone call to connect her with the one person that she'd been desiring to meet for the whole of her short life. A meeting was arranged. Millie said that for the first time she understood who she was. Her looks, her eyes, even her speech, her interests. Millie said it was like a father-shaped hole in her heart had been filled. Then it was Katie Faust's turn to speak. Katie explained to our parliamentarian that children need both a mum and a dad. 351 studies from 13 different countries show that mothers and fathers raising their children together is the model that most stacks the deck in favour of children. That historically, marriage has been the most child-beneficial institution the world has ever known. It is so foundational to the human experience that nearly every religion has something that resembles man-woman marriage. From having worked in a US adoption agency for many years, Katie was concerned that should homosexual marriage be legalised in Australia, many hundreds of orphans would not be placed with a mother and a father. Our meeting ended and we moved on, allowing our politician to get on with his work and Katie and Millie to meet some more members of Parliament. My husband Warwick and I co-founded Dads for Kids Fatherhood Foundation in 2002. Our goal is to encourage dads to be the best dads they can be for their children. We do this by providing a free weekly email to encourage dads and running Dads for Kids courses. We are involved in policy for dads and families at a grassroots level. We find ourselves involved in many things pertaining to family, as we also strive to encourage a return to the Judeo-Christian ethics that our country was founded on. There's one thing I've learned in 15 years. It's that in order to better engage civility, we need to get better at storytelling. What do I mean by that? Better at storytelling? Several months ago, my husband and I were involved in a forum designed as a think tank to strategise ways that we could slow the insidious march of pornography and its effects in our nation. A young but experienced media man had been engaged to talk to the group. He said that for too long, our side has presented facts, stats, and logical reasoning. But for far too long, the other side has been wooing society with story after story after story of love and equality. Emotive, personal stories change people's lives. We have to find some personal, good stories that fit with our media strategies. We have to find some personal, great and beautiful stories to display our point of view. Those around us, despite appearing to want to destroy the lovely, do long for happy, loving, good lives. So, armed with our new knowledge from the think tank, we decided to start telling stories. A picture tells 1,000 words, so we ran a Father's Day competition. Australia's Father's Day is held in September, so this competition has really only just ended. We called it the Dads for Kids Instagram Photo Competition. Dun, 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 dun. Entrants just had to post a photo of dads and kids, preferably with a caption. The response was overwhelming. Well, it was for us in Australia. We had over 1,000 entries, with many beautiful photos of dads engaging with their children in all sorts of situations. In fact, the judges found it quite difficult to choose a winner. But one photo floated to the top. It stood out above all others. And that's the photo that you saw earlier, which we are now going to attempt to put back up. And remember how long it took to get it off? Well, we'll see. Which way does it go? I tried that, yeah, I tried that. There we go. And now, we're in there.
Yeah.
In there. And just move this.
It's going to be recorded.
Please remember your password.
It's in moments like
I
these.
know, right?
You need.
And ignore my
Do you have
boxes.
meetings?
That's not a picture, that's my nephew. He's
He's So we actually had 3 photos from the lady who took this photo in the top 10. So she was a very good photographer.
So for the most part, was
Here
it
we go.
1,000 different entries with the exception of you?
Yes. Sorry?
1,000 different entries to the Instagram?
Oh, over 1,000. About 1,100. So it's very, we took a top 25 and then a top 10. And Naomi, the photographer, she, that's it there, she had 3 entries in the top 10. So that is a beautiful photo, isn't it? But I'm going to read you the caption. No, it's going to go off. So keep that picture in your mind as I read the caption.
I'm just going to stand here quietly.
Just after, I'll make a higher voice so you think it's somebody else's voice. Just after we got married, we lost a baby. Then followed a very hard and painful time. Feeling the depths of emptiness is something I will never forget. What followed was the blessing of the most amazing little boy and the start of our journey into parenthood and his into fatherhood. Isn't that lovely? Truly, this photo was worthy of being named first. So one entry equals 1,000 words. 1,000 entries. We estimate that this competition contacted over 100,000 people through Instagram. And it actually wasn't our idea, it was a young dad who said, you know, you should run an Instagram competition. And with his help, we did. So that's fine, you can close that off again if you're game. Before I conclude, let's go back to our original story. Let's look at the close of Katie Faust and Millie Fontana's visit to our parliamentarian on Tuesday, the 11th of August 2015. When we went to see the Conservative Country Party member, he was upset, distressed even, because his party had been excluded from a meeting with the Conservatives on homosexual marriage. The two parties are in a coalition, so his annoyance was quite understandable. His sort of smaller party had been excluded. That meeting began at 10 and was adjourned at noon. Then at 3 p.m, the then Prime Minister of Australia, that was Tony Abbott, called a meeting of both parties of the coalition to discuss the matter. Everybody had a chance to speak. And we were told that there were many impassioned speeches for and against homosexual marriage. We were also told that Millie Fontana, the girl who grew up without a father and two mothers, who by her own admission had a huge father hunger, she was mentioned in at least one of those impassioned speeches. The outcome? After 6 hours of debate and deliberations, Prime Minister Abbott announced that Australia's Conservative coalition would retain the definition of marriage as being between one man and one woman for life, and that upon re-election they would bring the matter before Australia in a people's vote. And that is quite meaningful for us because our voting is compulsory. So that involves everybody. It is a true people's vote. We're living in dangerous times. Times when the values we all hold dear, life, family and marriage, are being demonised daily. Don't we know every time we turn the TV on? If we're going to engage with our communities and our nations, we have to relearn the art of storytelling. Whether they're our own personal stories or those of others, we must learn to begin to tell them, to advance the case for life, family, marriage, and our freedom. This is the only way to win the battle for our children's future.
This will not cause us any problems as we move forward. I always hate being the final presenter because it sounds like there's so much overlap between the two, so forgive me in advance because there will be a little bit, but the presentations before me are just fabulous. Again, Jeanneane Maxon, I'm Vice President of External Affairs with Americans Unite for Life. Just a little about the organization I'm with. We're the legal architects of the pro-life movement in the United States. We're the ones who crafted the state-based strategy that you now see being so successful today, where pro-life laws are being enacted in states after we struggled on the federal level to really get things enacted. We were founded in 1971, which is 2 years before the Roe versus Wade decision in the states. And we've been involved in every life-related case before the U.S. Supreme Court since that time. Great group to work for. So why is someone that's involved in this organization and who's an attorney talking about cultural issues? Well, here's really one of the reasons is there does seem to be a correlation between the impact of the culture and what their viewpoint is on Supreme Court decisions. And anecdotally, you might have thought, kind of seen that maybe this is a little true, particularly the latest same-sex marriage decision. It feels like the culture kind of had this impact and the court made the decision. And now in the United States, everybody the next day was celebrating, you know, putting up rainbows on their Twitter feeds and things like that. So I looked into this more because, of course, one question is this reflective of the court changing its mind based on the way society is going, or is it also the opposite? The court makes a decision and suddenly society verifies whatever position and suddenly society feels comfortable. I think it may be a little bit of both. The good news is whether it's because people feel like they want to go and suddenly feel like, okay, the court's validated a social position, now we can be more vocal on it, or whether it's just the fact of the court kind of moving the same way as society. Either way, as far as it goes for the pro-life movement, it's to our advantage. There was a 1994 study done in the American Political Science Review that showed that there is in fact a correlation between Supreme Court decisions in the U.S. and the way the culture is going. They found that in the 130 decisions where they were able to locate polling data within the populace, that 87% were in line, 87% of the Supreme Court decisions in those cases were in line with the plurality. And again, you see this somewhat anecdotally with the same-sex marriage case and also with cases in the past like segregation. But as I mentioned, this is good news for the pro-life movement because in the United States at least, the pro-life movement is really between, the abortion issue is really split. So it's not a situation where people are so far extreme on the abortion issue that they're accepting the radical nature of our policy in the United States. So in the latest Gallup poll, which was in 2014, 46% of people self-identified as pro-life and 47% as pro-choice. The vast majority of people, the vast majority of their viewpoints is way out of line with the reality of the national policy of abortion in the United States. And I will say the United States is so radical on its abortion policy that if you're from a different country, you're already better off than we are, so that's good news for you as well. The United States is only one of 4 nations in the entire world where by the law, so the strict definitions by the law, because I'm quite certain that there are illegal abortions that occur in certain circumstances in other countries in the world, but the United States is only one of 4 nations in the entire world where legally you can have abortion through all 9 months of pregnancy for any reason whatsoever, including sex selection, that you didn't like, that you're pregnant with a girl, for example. The other countries where this is also true is Canada, North Korea, and China. That's a company that shares that. The rest of the world has more progressive abortion policies than we do in the United States. And so the point is that in terms of engaging civilly with our culture, most people on the life issue in the United States are already there. And I would think in the rest of the world, they're probably already there too, because their policies are quite as radical as ours. So 71%, according to Gallup, of Americans supported at least some restrictions on abortion. Only 28% believe that the current state of abortion as the law of the land, abortion on demand, was in line with their viewpoint. 79% of the people who self-identified as pro-choice actually believe that abortion should be illegal in the 3rd trimester. So this is really true for most Americans. And you might have noticed this just in terms of talking with your friends. One of the ways I like to engage civilly with people on this issue is just to ask them questions. Because on our issue we can't, because most people, again, are already there when it comes to abortion. When do you think abortion should be legal? I can almost always get people, whether they're my friends or whoever, down to 1st trimester, and for certain reasons. Almost always, very rarely do they go into the 2nd trimester. So that's good news for us because you can engage with people. The problem is they just don't realize how radical abortion policy is in the United States. So when I get them to their viewpoint, then I usually ask, well, you do realize that the people you're voting for have a drastic view. They usually don't believe me. And then I just tell them, go look it up. If you don't believe me, go look it up on your own. So I believe that that's a lot of the reasons, simply just acknowledging the truth and allowing the truth to come out is a lot of the reason why people are becoming more and more pro-life in the United States. Within the religious community, it's interesting because the Barna Group did a study in 2010, and they found that 78% of people who would self-identify as born-again evangelicals believe that abortion should be illegal in all or more circumstances. But the numbers dropped when you looked at other religions, so this actually surprised me. So they found that that number, when you look at just Catholics, is 53%. What I imagine happened was that they were not actually polling devout Catholics who regularly attend Mass. And I think that that's probably the difference there. I think that number would be much higher if they had polled not just people who maybe consider themselves culturally Catholic, right? But for other faiths, so for non-faiths, 54%. But another interesting aspect of the United States, again, just in terms of being able to point the truth out, sometimes we let the other side just hurt themselves. They have gotten to the point now where they completely admit that it's unborn life before the womb. There used to be a point where people would argue, no, it's just, a blob of tissue, a blob of cells. We've won that argument in the United States. The pro-abortionists even admit it. In fact, Francis Kiesling in 2013 in a Time magazine article said that abortion is not like having your tooth pulled or your appendix taken out. It involves the termination of an early form of human life. So that's the great news. We've won the baby debate. I think a lot of this is because of the rising technology with ultrasound. You have these millennials who are growing up who are actually more pro-life than their parents and grandparents. And I think a lot of that is because the first photo in their baby book is their ultrasound photo. So they're confronted with that truth at a very early age. And again, going back to the point is sometimes you can allow the opposition to shoot themselves in the foot and make their own mistakes and just make that public even without doing any commentary. And that's what we've kind of seen with the latest Planned Parenthood videos. I was involved with the Planned Parenthood video project personally since January of this year. And it's been terrifying to see some of the things. If you haven't seen the videos yet, I encourage you to do so. But that was an easy project just in terms of not having to provide additional commentary because all you had to do was kind of share the truth and people would call. There was a Salon magazine article. This just again goes to show how brazenly the pro-choice side has become about the fact that abortion does involve human life. In Salon magazine, there was a well-known pro-choice blogger a few years ago who came out with a blog entitled, "So What If Abortion Ends a Life?" And she went on to describe how it doesn't matter. We know it's a life, it doesn't matter. It's really just an issue of women should have the right to automatically decide the life or death of that unborn life based on their circumstances, which was quite appalling. And then sometimes the opposition just looks really ridiculous. So my favorite was when Cecile Richards was in an interview and they tried to nail her down on when do you think life began? When does life begin? And of course she couldn't say anything less than 9 months or else it would totally go against what they advocate at Planned Parenthood. So she had to say, well, in my circumstance with my kids, I didn't see them as being alive until they were born. Now your average American looks at that and it really diminishes her credibility because it's kind of ridiculous. But the reason why Roe is still in place in the United States is unfortunately because of this thing that we have termed the reliance interest. It's because there is one Supreme Court judge, Justice Kennedy, who sits on the court, who is kind of the swing vote right now. And he has taken the position that he cannot reverse Roe versus Wade because he believes women have come to rely on abortion to be equal players in society. So as a woman, I actually find this really, really offensive. But I think we can combat this area in the pro-life movement in the same way that we have looked at the areas with just the questions whether or not unborn life or release of life. Because the reality is, just like with that, the science and the data is on our side. There are hundreds of studies that demonstrate a connection between abortion and mental health problems. They're all conducted outside of the United States because there's a political bias in the United States inside the medical community, whether it's kind of your average medical community or whether it's associated with the medical community. There's a political bias. But there are tons of studies about this. You can find them all on AUL's website, www.aul.org. If you click a button called Women's Protection Project, there's a document there that outlines with footnotes a number of these studies. A few that I found most significant is that 65% of women who abort are more likely to score in the high risk range for clinical depression, and that the risk of suicide is 3 times greater. So in terms of engaging civilly, how do we present a winning message? Well, I think the first component is, again, going back and acknowledging the extremism of abortion in the United States as a policy. Most people aren't aware of it. They think, most people want to think, because it's easier to think this, abortion has to be legal in the United States because there's women who are going to be raped during these extreme circumstances, and they're going to need it. The reality is we don't even have to get to that question, because we're talking about a situation in the United States where we can abort a baby at 8 months because I didn't like that I'm pregnant with a girl. So I encourage people not to get pulled into the weeds of those other questions, but again, ask questions of people. Well, when do you think abortion should be legal? Well, first trimester only in cases of rape or incest. Okay, you have more in common with pro-life America, pro-life politicians, people like me, than you do with the people that you're voting for, with the positions of the people that you're saying. You're really more pro-life than you are pro-choice. Rethink how you self-identify. The younger generation is more pro-life, so this is another way that we're really winning. There's a great story, and this does have an impact. If you've ever been to the March for Life in Washington, D.C., which is held every year on the anniversary of Roe versus Wade, there are about 500,000 people who attend that. 90% of them are under the age of 30. And it's really cool to see. So again, going back to Alison's point of storytelling, this is just an encouraging story that I share with people in the pro-life movement. Nancy Keenan, who was the former president of NARAL Pro-Choice America, was going into work on DC the day of the March for Life, and when she was coming up the escalator of the metro, going out into the mall, she said that she looked around, she saw all the people at the March for Life, and she said to herself, and this is a direct quote, "There's so many of them, and they're so young, and there's so many of them." And she resigned her position 3 weeks later. So the cultural shift is having a significant impact. And it also is just in terms of the actual abortions that are being performed. They're now at their lowest rate since Roe. And in Texas, for example, they went from having 41 abortion clinics in 2014 down to 7 based on a bill that we helped pass there 2 years ago. So just some practical tips on kind of how to go about persuasion, and this really comes from Aristotle 1,000 years ago, mentioned ethos, logos, and pathos. So ethos is just building up your own credibility. And I like that Michael mentioned St. Paul, because I also like another scripture he said, which is, "I've learned to become all things to all people." I think that has a lot to do with that whole ethos component. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a dozen law degrees or political degrees, although those can help as well. But ethos is really relating to people in a way that you can actually persuade them. So it's not changing your position, but it's learning the culture, it's being flexible enough to have people feel comfortable around you, and you gain credibility with them. Logos is just really appealing to the brain, so that's the facts and statistics. I've heard that men are more wired towards that way, so that's why in any presentation I think it's important that you do have documentation of facts and statistics. That's a great position. But also the pathos, that's engaging with the heart. This is what Alison was talking about. That's why stories are really, really important. 3 stories, which you'll have to Google because I'm not going to have time to go into all of them, that I think are very compelling for the pro-life cause, are 3 stories of women who either died or almost died because of their abortion experience and who wished that they had had a different experience. Tanya Reeves, who's in Chicago, Cartamaya Monger, who died in Carmen Gosnell's clinic, and Caitlin Bruce, which is a story of a young lady who found herself in an unintentional pregnancy situation. She was from Michigan. Again, AUL's website has some great information. There's also a document you can find for more of that logo stuff in terms of getting facts and statistics, which is available at our booth called the New Leviathan. They're very free, so I encourage you to pick up a copy. With that, I'm going to hand it back to the moderator, who will lead us